January 1963. The big freeze had stopped the entire country. The rivers froze solid. The diesel in the buses turned to jelly. The factories fell silent. The modern economy was broken. But one man was out there. The rag and bone man. He wasn't braving the blizzard for sentiment. He was in a war for survival, because for him, winter wasn't just cold. It was the moment his horse could break its leg, his stock could rot, and his family could starve. While the rest of Britain waited for the thaw, he was fighting a battle against physics and economics that most people never saw. This is the story of how the rag and bone man turned the coldest winter in history into a frozen fortune. To understand this war, you first have to understand the battlefield. The rag and bone trade didn't have warehouses with central heating. There were no heated vans. The office was the driver's seat of a wooden cart, exposed to the wind, the rain, and the biting snow for 10 to 12 hours a day. In the summer, the totting trade was relatively easy. The days were long, the doors were open, and the mood was light. But winter changed the physics of the entire operation. The first casualty was the equipment itself. Imagine waking up at 5 a.m. in pitch darkness. The air is so cold it burns your lungs. Before you can even have a cup of tea, you have to go outside to the stable. The iron wheels of the cart, which were perfect for rolling over cobblestones, are now frozen solid to the ground. You have to chip them out with a hammer. The grease on the axles is thick like glue. And then there is the risk. Walking a horse on a tarmac road is fine, but walking a horse on ice, that is a death sentence. A horse weighs half a ton. If it slips on black ice, it breaks a leg. And in the 1960s, a horse with a broken leg didn't go to a hospital. It was the end of the animal and the end of the business. So the rag and bone man had to become a blacksmith every single morning. They used something called sharps or frost nails. These were special nails with a raised chisel-like head that bit into the ice. Every morning in the freezing cold, the Totter would have to lift the horse's heavy hooves and hammer these studs in, just to give his partner a fighting chance of staying upright. It was back-breaking work before the day had even started. But the struggle wasn't just about the horse, it was about the man. You have to remember, this was before the era of technical fabrics. There was no Gore-Tex, no lightweight thermal fleece. The rag and bone man wore the cast-offs of the empire. Most Totters wore great coats. These were heavy, thick woolen military coats left over from the First and Second World Wars. They were incredibly warm, yes, but they were incredibly heavy, and once they got wet, they stayed wet for weeks. A Totter would put on a damp coat in the morning and take off a damp coat at night. The smell of damp wool, stale tobacco and horse sweat was the perfume of the trade. And on their hands, you will notice in the old photos that Totters rarely wore full gloves. They wore mittens, often just old wool socks with holes cut for the thumbs. Why expose your fingers to frostbite? Because of the touch. You cannot tell the difference between iron and brass through thick leather gloves. You have to touch the metal. You have to feel the weight, the temperature, the texture. Iron is cold, lead is soft, brass feels different. To grade the scrap you needed your skin, so they sacrificed their hands. Old men from the trade will show you their knuckles, covered in scars from winter cuts. Handling frozen cast iron is like handling dry ice. It burns the skin. By February, their hands were a map of cracks and open sores that wouldn't heal until the spring thaw. Once they were on the road, they faced the wet wool trap. You see, a Totter's main income came from rags, wool, cotton, linen. In the summer, this was white gold. It was light, easy to stack, and sold for a high price at the mill. But winter turned this gold into lead. If you are out in a blizzard, or even just that constant grey British drizzle, your cart gets wet. If the rags get wet, disaster strikes. Firstly, wet wool is incredibly heavy. A sack that weighed 50 pounds dry could weigh 150 pounds wet. That is extra weight for the horse to pull, for no extra profit. Secondly, the merchants at the rag yards were not stupid. If you turned up with a load of soaking wet jumpers and coats, they wouldn't pay you for the water weight. They would dock the weight, basically guessing how much was water and deducting it from your pay. Or worse, if the rags were starting to rot or smell because of the damp, they would turn you away completely. So the Totter had to become an expert in logistics. He wasn't just throwing junk on a cart, he was building a fortress. He used heavy tar-covered canvas sheets to wrap the load. He learned how to tie frozen knots, ropes that were stiff with ice but had to hold tight in a gale. He spent half his day just protecting his stock from the sky, because a dry sack of wool in January was worth more than copper. And it didn't stop when he got home. Many Totters, desperate to save their stock from rotting, would bring the rags inside their own houses. Imagine a small terraced house with the living room filled with damp, smelling old coats hanging from the ceiling, draped over chairs, stacked near the fire. The smell of wet wool and damp dog would permeate the furniture, the food, the curtains. The families hated it. The wives would argue about the mess and the smell, but the Totter knew the truth. If you could dry those rags out by morning, you could put food on the table. It was a domestic invasion, a sacrifice of comfort for survival. But there is a part of this story that often gets ignored. We talk about the economics, the rags, the money, but we forget the heart of the operation, the engine, the horse. In the winter, the relationship between the rag and bone man and his horse changed. In the summer, the horse was a worker. In the winter, he became a brother. You have to remember, these men spent 10 hours a day alone on the streets. No radio, no mobile phone, just the sound of the wind. The only living soul they had to talk to was the horse, and in the biting cold, that bond became the difference between life and death. Old Totters tell stories of the nosebag ritual. When it was time for lunch, there were no cafes open to them. No pub would let a dirty rag man in. The man wouldn't eat first. He would stop the cart in a sheltered spot, maybe down an alleyway out of the wind. He would take the heavy nosebag, fill it with oats and chaff, and hook it over the horse's ears. Then he would take his own heavy wool coat off. Yes, standing in his shirt sleeves in the freezing cold, and drape it over the horse's back. Why? Because a horse that stops moving in the cold creates a massive risk. Its sweat freezes, it can get a chill in its kidneys. A kidney chill kills a horse in 24 hours. The man risked his own health, freezing his own bones to keep his partner safe. Only then would the man sit down on the curb, pour a cup of tea from a thermos, and maybe share his jam sandwich with the horse. They would sit there, two warm breaths puffing into the cold air, waiting for the snow to pass. It wasn't just sentimental, it was survival. If the man froze, the horse could find its way home, and they often did. But if the horse froze, the man was finished. There was a deep, silent respect. The horse pulled the weight, and the man took the worry. They were partners in a way that a modern delivery driver and his van never will be. A van doesn't care if you are cold. A van doesn't nudge you with its nose when you've been walking for too long. This was a partnership forged in ice. So how did they actually make money when everyone was locked indoors? This is where the rag and bone man proved he was a better psychologist than any modern salesman. In the summer, the doors were open. In the winter, the doors were bolted shut to keep the heat in. A housewife in 1963 didn't want to open the front door to a stranger and let all her precious heat out. In the winter, the exchanges became brighter, shinier, and more exciting. The goldfish in a plastic bag, the bright red balloon, the donkey stone for cleaning the steps. He knew that a goldfish was a splash of tropical color in a frozen world. A child would hear the bell, see the fish through the frosted window, and beg their mother, "Mum, please, just find something." The mother, wanting to keep the peace and clear some clutter, would run around the house finding an old wool coat or a broken kettle, just to trade for that fish. The Totter knew exactly what he was doing. He was trading a penny's worth of fish for a shilling's worth of wool. But he also brought a moment of excitement to a frozen street. It was a transaction of warmth, a brief chat on the doorstep, a joke about the weather, a transaction that made both sides feel like they had won. But the smartest rag and bone men didn't just rely on what they collected that day. They were futures traders. They knew that January and February would be the starving months. They knew the snow would be too deep to take the cart out some days. People would have nothing left to throw away after Christmas. So in the summer, when the harvest was good, the smart Totter wouldn't sell everything. He would take the non-ferrous metals, the copper, the brass, the lead, and he would hide it. He would stash sacks of copper piping in his shed, under his bed, or bury it in the back garden. This was his winter bank. When the blizzard hit and he couldn't work for a week, he didn't starve. He would go to his shed, pull out a sack of summer copper, and walk it to the merchant. The price of metal didn't drop just because it was snowing. In fact, sometimes it went up because of the scarcity. While factory workers were being laid off because of power cuts and fuel shortages, the rag and bone man, the man everyone thought was poor, was surviving comfortably on the interest from his summer labor. He had liquidity when the rest of the country was insolvent. It was a master class in financial planning, done by men who often couldn't read or write, but who understood the market better than a banker. Eventually the thaw came, the snow melted, but the world that emerged from those winters began to change. The horse and cart couldn't compete with the new transit vans that had heaters and could drive on the motorways. The Clean Air Acts meant people stopped burning coal, so there were fewer ashes to collect. The councils started sending round big dustbin lorries to take the rubbish away for free. The Totter was slowly pushed out. The man who had braved the blizzard to take away your junk was replaced by a sterile municipal service. But we lost something when we lost him. We lost that grit. We lost the connection between the value of waste and the effort of collection. Today, if it snows just a few inches, the council bin lorry doesn't come. You get a text message saying service suspended due to health and safety. We have to wait 2 weeks piling our rubbish up in the kitchen. But back then, there were no silent notifications. The world was quieter, heavier, and in that deep muffled silence of a snowy morning you would hear it. First, the slow, heavy, rhythmic clop-clop of iron shoes on icy cobblestones. Then, the grinding of wooden wheels fighting through the drifts. And finally, that bell. It wasn't just a noise, it was an announcement. It cut through the dead silence of the snow like a knife. You would rush to the front room, shivering in your pajamas, your breath misting up the glass. You would scrape a small, clear circle in the thick frost on the window with your fingernail, just to get a peek. And there they were. You would see the steam rising from the horse's back in the freezing air, billowing up like smoke from a steam engine. To a child's eyes, that horse looked like a dragon breathing fire in the cold. You would see a man in a flat cap, his face red and raw from the wind, stopping not to check a phone but to wrap his own heavy wool coat around his partner's shoulders. He was the original 24/7 service, long before the internet existed. But he didn't have a heater to turn on. He didn't have thermal gloves or waterproof boots. He didn't have a pension plan waiting for him. He just had cracked hands, a loyal horse, and the absolute stubborn will to survive. He stood there in the biting wind, trading a goldfish for a bag of old rags, smiling through chattering teeth because he knew that this trade meant dinner on the table. He taught us something we have forgotten in our throwaway world. He taught us that value isn't just in what you buy brand new, it's in what you save, what you fix, and what you refuse to waste. And he taught us that when the world freezes over, the only thing that keeps you moving is the friend walking beside you. So spare a thought for the rag and bone man, the man who braved the blizzard and turned the coldest, darkest months into a frozen fortune.